Alright, let's go. Number 10. Galena. In 1922, when Howard Carter and his team cataloged the contents of Tutankhamun's sealed treasury, they documented 6 alabaster kohl containers sitting on a storage chest, small jars, each sealed with linen stoppers, each inscribed with the king's cartouche. The analysis of their contents, conducted, identified the same compound found in cosmetic vessels across every significant Egyptian royal tomb from the Old Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period. Galena, lead sulfide, one of the most toxic metallic compounds in nature, placed inside the sealed chambers of Egypt's dead for 3,000 years. Galena is heavy, nearly 7 times denser than water. A nugget the size of a walnut carries the weight of a stone. Ground between flat rocks, it produces a fine gray-black dust that clings to the skin and resists washing. Mixed with animal fat or castor oil, it forms a thick paste. Applied around the eyes, it produces the characteristic marking that appears on every carved face, every divine figure in Egyptian visual culture, from roughly 3100 BCE to the Roman period, 3,000 years without interruption. The accepted explanation for most of the modern study of Egyptology has been straightforwardly practical. Galena reduced glare from light reflecting off the Nile. It created a physical barrier against flies, reducing the transmission of trachoma and other eye infections common in the Nile Valley. It made the eyes visible at distance in public ritual, a cosmetic technology that happened also to be medicinal. But that's where the practical account ends, and the chemistry becomes harder to categorize. In 2010, researchers at the Louvre and the French National Center for Scientific Research, led by chemist Philippe Walter, published a systematic analysis of 100 ancient Egyptian kohl samples drawn from museum collections across Europe. The results fractured the practical narrative from the inside. A significant proportion of the galena samples contained lead compounds, specifically lead chloride and lead hydroxychloride, that do not occur naturally in galena ore and cannot be produced by weathering or time alone. They require deliberate synthesis, heating lead sulfide in the controlled presence of sodium chloride and moisture over precisely timed intervals, at temperatures achievable with a simple brazier. Not a cosmetic formula, a manufacturing protocol. Walter's team proposed that these synthesized lead compounds had specific antimicrobial properties that raw galena lacked, a pharmacological advantage that justified the additional labor-intensive preparation. The implication is that by at least 1000 BC, Egyptian kohl producers had developed intentional secondary lead chemistry to engineer a compound with properties they could not have named, but had identified through generations of applied observation. The galena that came out of that process was not the galena that came out of the ground. Here is what accumulated alongside the protection. Chronic low-dose lead exposure damages the peripheral nervous system. It reduces cognitive processing speed, it narrows the range of emotional response and produces behavioral changes, irritability, reduced impulse control, elevated aggression that progress slowly enough over years and decades that the person experiencing them cannot reliably identify the onset. There is no moment when the lead announces itself. The cognitive terrain simply shifts, gradually, in a direction the person inside it has no reference point to recognize. The most elaborately adorned faces belong to the pharaohs, to the high priests, to the women of the royal household who wore the heaviest application from early childhood. The great wives of the New Kingdom, the women who advised the pharaohs and in some cases governed independently, were among the most heavily kohl-painted individuals in Egyptian iconography. Their application extended well beyond the eye socket into elaborate wing shapes that required significant quantities of the compound, applied to sensitive facial tissue multiple times daily. The kohl that marked divinity was delivering a neurotoxin to the people closest to power. Not a cosmetic, a compound, sealed in alabaster, buried with the dead, applied to the faces of the living for 3,000 years. Number 9. Natron. Wadi Natron sits 90 kilometers northwest of Cairo, a long depression in the western desert floor where a chain of shallow saline lakes evaporates through the Egyptian summer to leave white crystalline deposits along the shoreline. The compound is natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate. By the Old Kingdom, access to the Wadi Natron deposits was regulated by the state. The material was collected under administrative oversight, stored in sealed containers, and distributed through official channels to the temple complexes where its most critical use took place. The mummification texts are specific about quantities and duration. 70 days in nature. The body packed in the crystalline compound or submerged in a concentrated natron solution, while the soft tissues dehydrated and contracted against the bone structure beneath. The standard account treats this as straightforward preservation chemistry, a desiccant technology applied to delay biological decomposition long enough for the theological protocols surrounding death to be completed. That separation, chemistry on one side, theology on the other, doesn't hold when you look at where the chemistry was actually occurring. The priests who managed mummification, called the WT in Egyptian sources, operated inside the per-nefer, the House of Beauty, for sustained periods. These were not outdoor processing facilities. The per-nefer was an enclosed workspace, walls, ceiling, limited ventilation by modern standards, where multiple bodies in various stages of preparation were handled simultaneously. At Upper Egyptian summer temperatures that routinely exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, natron behaves differently than it does in a laboratory at controlled temperature. Heated natron produces aerosols, specifically sodium carbonate particles fine enough to penetrate the upper airways and the mucous membranes of the nasal passage. The concentration of these aerosols in a closed workspace with multiple natron-packed bodies at summer temperatures over the course of a 6 to 8 hour working day is not a figure that has been calculated in any peer-reviewed study. It is, however, a figure that can be estimated, and the estimate is not negligible. Inhaled alkaline aerosols at sustained concentrations produce mucosal inflammation, alterations in blood CO2 levels through respiratory alkalinity shifts, and in sensitive individuals, dissociative episodes that the affected person would have no chemical framework to attribute to the material they were handling. The 2017 analysis of an embalming workshop from the 26th dynasty, excavated at Abu Sir and published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, identified 17 distinct chemical residues in the workshop vessels. Natron was among them. So were beeswax, pistacia resin, juniper oil, and compounds consistent with animal fat decomposition. The atmospheric chemistry inside a per-nefer during an active working session, multiple organic volatiles from the preparation compounds mixing with the aerosols from heated natron in an enclosed space, has no modern equivalent to compare against. No occupational health standard was ever designed for it. Herodotus, writing in 440 BC, described the embalming workers as a distinct and restricted priestly class, separated from ordinary funerary workers, and held to ritual purity requirements he presents as religious in nature. He treats the separation as theological. He had no mechanism for understanding that the isolation of the W priests from the general population and the chemical environment they worked inside were the same fact described from two different explanatory systems. The salt of the gods preserved the bodies of the dead. The people who worked in its presence daily paid a cost the theology did not have language for. Number 8. Frankincense. In 1482 BE, the fleet dispatched by the Egyptian queen Hatshepsut returned from a land the Egyptians called Punt, a region somewhere along the southern Red Sea coast, possibly modern Somalia or Eritrea, carrying a cargo list unlike any previously recorded. Among the ivory, ebony, living animals, and gold were 31 live boswellia trees, transported in woven baskets with their root systems intact, attended by their own handlers during the sea voyage, destined for replanting in the terraced gardens of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. The expedition is recorded on the temple walls in extraordinary detail. The carving shows the trees being loaded. It shows the ships. It records the number, 31. Boswellia sacra does not transplant well. The trees are adapted to specific soil conditions in semi-arid coastal environments. Most of those 31 specimens were dead within years of their arrival in the Nile Valley. The labor required to carry 31 living trees across the Red Sea with root systems intact in a period when ocean transport depended on sail and oar was extraordinary, disproportionate to what the commercial resin trade alone could justify. Egypt could purchase boswellia resin through existing trade networks. It did not need the trees themselves. The framing held for decades. Then modern pharmacology ran the burning compound through a mass spectrometer. In 2008, Arya Musayev and colleagues at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem published research in the FASEB journal identifying incensol acetate, a compound produced when boswellia resin burns, as a psychoactive agent. Specifically, the compound activates TRPV3 ion channels in regions of the brain associated with anxiety regulation and emotional problems. In the mouse models used in the study, insensyl acetate produced measurable anxiolytic and antidepressive behavioral effects at concentrations achievable through inhalation. The Pharaohs paper described the mechanism as potentially explaining the calming psychological effects attributed to frankincense use across multiple ancient cultures. What it could not account for, and did not attempt to, was the architectural context in which Egypt burned it. The innermost sanctum of a major Egyptian temple, the room housing the god statue where the daily ritual was performed and no ordinary person was permitted to enter, was a sealed stone chamber with minimal ventilation by design. The ceiling was low relative to the volume of smoke a ceremonial brazier would produce. Morning rituals at Karnak and Luxor involved burning frankincense continuously for the duration of the opening ceremony. Evening rituals repeated the process for the closing sequence. The priests who performed these ceremonies, the same individuals who interpreted divine will, advised the pharaoh on matters of state, and managed the temple's economic and agricultural holdings, spent hours inside those chambers each day. At the concentrations achievable in a sealed stone sanctuary with an active brazier and minimal ventilation, insensyl acetate would have been operating at the upper end of its behaviorally active range. The Ebers Papyrus, compiled around 1550 BCE but incorporating medical traditions significantly older, lists frankincense in preparations described as calming the heart in its agitation. In Egyptian medical epistemology, the heart was not the seat of emotion alone. It was the organ of cognition, memory, and moral. The entire integrated mental life of a person was located in the heart. A compound prescribed to calm it was not an aromatherapy product. It was a pharmacological intervention in the central processing organ of the Egyptian person. Hatshepsut's 31 trees died. The resin still came from Punt by ship, from Byblos by caravan, from the incense road across southern Arabia. Egypt burned it every day at every major temple for 3,000 years. The priests who breathed it most were the same people who governed the civilization in the god's name. Number 7. Antimony. Chemical analysis of cosmetic vessels recovered from the tomb of Amenhotep III at Thebes, dated to approximately 1350 BCE, identified among their contents antimony trisulfide. Stibnite, a heavy metallic mineral with a distinctive gray-black luster that, ground to a fine powder, produces a cosmetic pigment nearly indistinguishable in appearance from galena kohl. Both serve the same visual function in Egyptian ritual and daily life. Both appear in medical papyri with overlapping indications. The differences are in what they do inside the body. The conventional account treats antimony as a variant cosmetic, a more brilliant, darker alternative to galena, associated with specific ritual contexts and particular deity relationships. The medical papyri listed in wound preparations. Dioscorides, the 1st century military physician whose pharmacological texts remained authoritative in Europe for 15 centuries, included antimony in his Materia Medica as an astringent for skin conditions and as an emetic at elevated doses. The standard account stops at cosmetics. The dosing data doesn't. Antimony enters the body transdermally. The absorption rate through intact skin is low relative to ingestion but not negligible, and the Egyptian application pattern, daily use over decades beginning in childhood, accumulates what single exposures disperse. Once inside the body, antimony is metabolized into antimony trioxide, which the International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies as a possible human carcinogen. Its primary acute toxicity mechanism involves the heart. Antimony trioxide produces prolonged QT interval, the electrophysiological signature that modern cardiology associates with sudden cardiac arrest in otherwise apparently healthy individuals. The dose that produces the cardiac effect is not dramatically higher than the dose encountered through sustained cosmetic use. The therapeutic window is narrow in both directions. What makes antimony's trajectory through history genuinely difficult to rationalize as coincidence is the consistency of the pattern. In medieval European medicine, antimony-cast metal pills called perpetual pills were prescribed as purgatives. The patient swallowed the pill, recovered it from excrement, cleaned it, and either reused it or passed it to the next patient. The pill circulated through households and medical practices for decades, sometimes generations. Abbey records from the 15th and 16th centuries document unexplained fatalities following antimony treatments with enough regularity that the compound's French name, antimoine, acquired a folk etymology, probably apocryphal but historically persistent, connecting it to deaths among monks who had received it as treatment. The toxicity was not invisible. It was legible to practitioners who observed it across multiple patients over time. What was missing was the mechanistic framework to name it. The Egyptian funerary practice of placing antimony cosmetic vessels in sealed tombs as grave goods, present in multiple New Kingdom royal burials, reflects a belief that the compound was necessary to carry into whatever came after death. The same logic governed what was sent with the dead that the dead had needed while living. Antimony was in the tombs because antimony was considered essential. Its chemical nature was not the point. Nothing about the damage announces itself in advance. Number 6. Kyphi. On the inner walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, constructed during the Ptolemaic period and formally dedicated in 57 BC, a formula is inscribed in hieratic script within the ritual precinct that ordinary temple visitors could not enter. It describes the preparation of kyphi, the sacred compound burned in Egyptian temples at the close of each day from at least the New Kingdom onward. The formula lists 16 ingredients. It specifies a preparation sequence. The order of addition and the timing of each step are not arbitrary. They are given explicitly, as if the order itself is load-bearing. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century Say, recorded his own version of the kyphi recipe in De Aesid et Osiride, his treatise on Egyptian religion. He listed among the ingredients honey, wine, raisins, resin, myrrh, cassia, juniper berries, sweet flag, and cypress grass. He then described what the compound produced. Kyphi induces sleep and brightens the dreams, and relaxes what is strained, and soothes what is inflamed, and dissolves what is rigid. Plutarch was a Greek biographer and essayist writing as an outside observer of Egyptian religious practice. He was not a pharmacologist, but his description of Kyphi's effects is clinically specific in a way that distinguishes it from the rhetoric of incense appreciation. The evening incense narrative is accurate as far as it goes. The ingredient list goes considerably further. Sweet flag, Acorus calamus, listed in both the Edfu inscription and multiple historical versions of the kyphi recipe, was classified by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in 1968 as a prohibited food additive. The reason was its primary alkaloid, beta-acerone. Beta-acerone is structurally related to the amphetamine family. At moderate oral doses in animal studies, it produces psychostimulant effects. At higher concentrations, it produces hallucinatory responses. It is also a mild monoamine oxidase inhibitor, a class of compounds that, when combined with other psychoactive agents, amplifies their bioavailability and extends their duration of action. The wine base of the kyphi preparation supplied the alcohol necessary to significantly increase beta-acerone absorption. The preparation sequence at Edfu is not ceremonial in its structure. It is chemically meaningful. Resins are added only after the liquid base has been reduced by heat, a step that would concentrate and preserve the alcohol-soluble alkaloids that early heat exposure would destroy. Dry components are ground separately before combination, standard practice in pharmaceutical compounding, to ensure even distribution of active compounds throughout the mixture. The sequence preserves volatile psychoactive materials that an unordered combination would lose. This is not a recipe for perfume. It is a pharmaceutical extraction protocol rendered in the language of sacred production. Kyphi was burned in the sealed inner sanctuaries of major temples at the specific hour of sunset, during the closing rites that marked the end of each day's divine service. This was the session during which the officiating priests were in their longest continuous period inside the innermost chamber, the most enclosed space in the temple, with the least ventilation, where smoke accumulation was highest. The Ebers Papyrus lists kyphi as a medical treatment for what it calls wandering of the heart, a clinical phrase appearing in the context of dissociated mental states, grief-related cognitive disruption, and what we might today describe as anxiety with depersonalization features. The formula at Edfu is inscribed on a wall that initiates of the temple could. The recipe itself was not the secret. What was secret, what was held within the priestly lineages and not committed to any wall, was the precision of preparation, the specific proportions, the quality and provenance of the Acorus calamus, the temperature of the reduction, the variables that determined whether any given batch of kaifi was aromatic incense or something that crossed the threshold of behavioral action. Whether the evening temple incense regularly crossed that threshold, the inscriptions do not record. What they record is that the compound used for 3,000 years in the most important ritual of the Egyptian day contained a substance modern regulatory science considers unsafe for any consumer use whatsoever. Number 5. Mandrake wine. In 2001, at Deir el Medina, the village on the west bank of Luxor built to house the craftsmen who excavated and painted the Valley of the Kings, an excavation team recovered sealed ceramic vessels from a midden deposit associated with one of the village's household units. Chemical analysis of the vessel interiors identified atropine and hyoscyamine, the two principal alkaloids of Mandragora officinarum, mandrake root. The vessels were dated to the 20th dynasty, 1180 to 1070 BCE. This was not unexpected in the sense that the presence of mandrake in Egyptian material culture was already documented. The Ebers Papyrus, compiled around 1550 BC but drawing on medical traditions that predate it significantly, mentions mandrake in 8 separate entries: as a sedative preparation for surgical contexts, as an anesthetic for wound cauterization, and in a compound for what the text describes as giving sleep to a person who is greatly distressed in their heart. The Hearst Papyrus records similar preparations. The Smith Papyrus, a surgical manual dating to roughly the same period, references preparations with sedative and analgesic properties that later pharmacological analysis has associated with anticholinergic compounds. What the Deir el Medina discovery confirmed was that mandrake preparation was not limited to the formal medical context of scribal physicians. The workers who built the royal tombs were producing it in their homes. In royal burial contexts, mandrake appears in a different form. The broad woven floral collars placed across the chests and shoulders of New Kingdom royal mummies, found in multiple tomb assemblages, including decorative representations in Amenhotep III's tomb goods, contained mandrake fruits among their botanical components. Chemical identification of the species is confirmed. The collars were placed in direct contact with the prepared body. The Egyptians who composed these collars were not choosing ingredients at random. Every plant and every garland placed in a royal tomb had a documented function in the medical, ritual, or mythological record. The symbolic reading of mandrake's presence is straightforward. Mandrake fruits are orange, aromatic, and associated in Egyptian mythology with Hathor, the goddess of intoxication, sexuality, music, and the transition between states of consciousness. A love token, a marker of divine feminine power. The Turin Erotic Papyrus, dating to approximately 1150 BCE, and currently held in the Museo Egizio in Turin, depicts mandrake alongside scenes of intimate encounter, rendered with explicit botanical specificity. The plant appears in the visual grammar of altered states and boundary dissolution throughout New Kingdom art. The chemical residue is not symbolic. Mandrake root contains scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine in concentrations sufficient to produce sedation, prolonged hallucination, and, at doses not dramatically higher than the sedating threshold, cardiac arrest. Scopolamine at the doses achievable from a prepared mandrake infusion produces what modern psychopharmacology calls an anticholinergic syndrome: dry skin, elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, and a dissociative state in which the person is conscious but disconnected from the physical environment, frequently experiencing hallucinations indistinguishable from waking reality, with subsequent memory that is fragmented or absent. The Ebers Papyrus dosing notes reflect the accumulated product of clinical observation over generations. The text does not specify exact quantities in modern terms, but the language around preparation, specific ratios of root to liquid, specific durations of processing, specific warnings about administration, is the language of a pharmacological tradition that had learned the hard way where the margin was. The workers at Deir el Medina who sealed the ceramic vessels later found in the midden were the same individuals who spent their professional lives painting resurrection imagery on the sealed walls of the tombs where the kings would be laid. They understood what the compound did to the living. They documented its effects and passed the knowledge through professional lineages that operated continuously for centuries. They put it in the grave goods anyway, not despite understanding what it was, but because of it, what they believed it would do for the dead that it had done for the living. The painted walls do not say. The sealed vessels did not say either. Number 4. Blue lotus. Among the botanical material strewn across Tutankhamun's wrapped mummy when Howard Carter opened the inner burial chamber on November 26, 1922, botanists later identified petals of Nymphea caerulea, the Egyptian blue lotus. Not placed as a single ceremonial stem, not arranged decoratively, scattered across the body in a pattern consistent with deliberate funerary ritual documented in Egyptian visual and textual sources across 5 centuries before Tutankhamun's death. Nymphea caerulea is a water lily, not a lotus in the botanical sense. It grows on the surface of standing water, opens fully at sunrise, closes and descends below the surface at dusk. It does this reliably, every day, regardless of season, from the first warm weeks of the Egyptian year through the inundation and back. To an observer who watched the Nile each morning, the pale blue petals rising from the water at the same moment the sun crested the eastern horizon were not a symbol of the solar cycle. They were the solar cycle, enacted biologically, on the surface of the river, every single day without exception. The standard scholarly position treats this as theological metaphor. The blue lotus represented rebirth, the emergence of the creator from the primordial waters of Nun, the daily resurrection of Ra. The lotus iconography in Egyptian funerary art, which is extensive, appearing in tomb paintings from at least the 18th dynasty onward, is categorized as symbolic, a visual language expressing theological concepts through natural forms. Book of the Dead Chapter 81 complicates this. Chapter 81 is titled Transformation into a Lotus. It is spoken over the dead. The text does not describe the lotus as a metaphor for resurrection. It describes the deceased undergoing a physical transformation into the lotus itself, submerging into the primordial water and rising from it in the form of the flower. The Egyptian theological framework did not always maintain the distinction between symbol and mechanism that modern analysis applies to it from outside. The theological explanation is internally consistent. What it cannot account for is the pharmacology. Nymphea caerulea contains 2 documented psychoactive alkaloids, nuciferine and apomorphine. Apomorphine is a direct dopamine receptor agonist. It activates the brain's dopamine pathways without requiring enzymatic conversion. Modern medicine uses synthetic apomorphine in microdose form as a treatment for Parkinson's disease, the relevant mechanism being dopaminergic stimulation of motor control circuits and at higher concentrations as a fast-acting emetic. Between those clinical bookmarks, in the dosage range accessible through the Egyptian preparation method, apomorphine produces euphoria, dissolution of the perceived boundary between self and environment, and in clinical literature, what has been described as a temporary suspension of the ordinary constraints on ego definition. Nuciferin is a mild sedative with antipsychotic properties that modulates and extends the apomorphine effect. The Egyptian preparation method was not ingestion of the raw flower. Tomb paintings and vessel analysis both point to steeping, petals submerged in wine for hours or days, allowing the fat-soluble and alcohol-soluble alkaloids to transfer into the liquid. What was then consumed was not wine flavored with lotus petals. It was wine used as a delivery medium for the alkaloids the lotus contained. The New Kingdom banquet scenes from Theban tombs, appearing in painted form in dozens of elite burials across the 18th and 19th dynasties, show attendants distributing blue lotus to guests, guests pressing the flower to their faces and inhaling, guests holding the flower in one hand while drinking from a cup in the other. The scenes are consistent in their botanical detail. The artists, who were the same craftsmen working at D.L. Medina, were documenting a behavioral practice they recognized and could render specifically. The petals scattered across Tutankhamun's body were the same compound, the same alkaloids, the same flowers, placed against the body of a 19-year-old king in the moment when, according to Egyptian theology, the boundary between the living self and whatever came after it was most permeable. The mechanism was placed in contact with the boundary. The chamber was sealed around it. Whether the priests who arranged those petals believed the pharmacology operated across that particular threshold, or whether they were completing a ritual whose mechanism they understood in theological rather than chemical terms, the physical action was identical. The compound was there. It has been identified. It is still the same compound today as it was in 1323 BCE. Number 3. Opium. In 1937, excavations at Tel El Ajjul near modern Gaza, led by Flinders Petrie, recovered a group of small ceramic vessels that would spend the next 6 decades being discussed without anyone running the chemistry that resolved the question of what they had contained. The vessels are called base ring juglets, named for the circular ridge they stand on. Narrow-mouthed, vertically elongated, their surface decorated with thin applied ridges and occasionally painted slip. The specific ceramic profile reproduces, with an anatomical precision that is not accidental, the silhouette of an inverted papaver somniferum capsule, the seed pod of the opium poppy, tilted downward as a harvester would hold it to allow the latex to drip from the incisions made in the pod wall. The vessels had been manufactured in Cyprus during the Late Bronze Age and traded into Egypt beginning in the 18th dynasty. They appear in royal palace deposits, in private household contexts, and in funerary assemblages, the full range of contexts, not limited to any particular social use. Their shape was considered possibly decorative, suggestive, but not conclusive. The residue analysis was conclusive. In 2004, gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis of interior residue from base ring juglets held in British museum collections confirmed the alkaloid fingerprint of papaver somniferum latex, morphine, codeine. The vessels had contained opium. The poppy-shaped vessel had been used to store, transport, and presumably dispense opium. The form and the function were the same object. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence excavated at Akhenaten's capital in 1887, now distributed across collections in Berlin, Cairo, and London, are clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform recording communications between the Egyptian pharaoh and the rulers of neighboring states during the 14th century BCE. They document the trade in specific commodities: copper from Cyprus, cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from Nubian tributaries. Among the items recorded in correspondence between Egypt and Alashia, the ancient name for Cyprus, is a substance described in Akkadian as oil of the poppy, listed alongside strategic metals and high-value construction materials. Not as a curiosity or a luxury novelty, as a commodity of diplomatic equivalence, the kind exchanged between rulers as demonstration of good faith. The Harris Papyrus, one of the largest administrative documents surviving from the New Kingdom, a roll nearly 41 meters long recording the economic activities of Ramesses III, lists opium among tribute items collected from territories under Egyptian authority. The London Medical Papyrus, dated to approximately 1325 BCE, specifies poppy juice in a preparation for children's pain. The instruction to the physician includes a phrase that translates as "stop the crying immediately," a pediatric opiate preparation with explicit dosing intent, with an outcome measure. In 2012, isotopic and organic residue analysis of bone and dental material from the workers' cemetery at Tel El Amarna, the burial ground of the laborers who built Akhenaten's capital, not the royalty who inhabited it, found morphine metabolite residue in the bone matrix of multiple specimens. The opium trade did not operate at the level of royal luxury alone. It ran through the military, the medical system, the tribute economy, and the domestic life of the craftsmen who built the monuments. At every social level for which we have recoverable material, opium appears. As medicine, as diplomatic currency, as an object of administrative record, as something placed in sealed burial vessels to accompany the dead. What the dead were understood to need the compound for, the burial texts do not specify. Number 2. Cinnabar. The Valley of the Kings is a dry limestone valley on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, cut into the Theban hills by geological processes that left its walls honey-combed with natural fractures. Beginning with the 18th dynasty and continuing through the 20th, the walls were cut further by human tools, long descending corridors driven into the rock, widening into antechambers, and then into burial halls. Every surface of every corridor and chamber was plastered and painted, not decorated in the loose sense, painted in the strict technical sense, covered floor to ceiling with pigmented compositions from the religious texts that describe the underworld journey of the king's soul. The craftsmen who applied these images spent their working lives inside sealed rock-cut spaces. They were the servants in the place of truth, a hereditary guild based at Deir el-Medina, organized into 2 crews working from opposite sides of any given project, lighting their workspace with oil lamps whose wicks were trimmed to minimize smoke. They worked in conditions that modern occupational health standards would not permit. They worked inside those conditions for their entire adult professional lives. Among the pigments they applied was one with a specific hazard no one in the ancient world had the conceptual framework to identify: cinnabar. Mercury sulfide, HGS, the most intensely saturated red pigment available in the ancient world, a color so vivid so different from the iron oxide reds used for ordinary applications that it was reserved in Egyptian funerary contexts for specific iconographic categories. The serpents of the Duat, the blood of Osiris, the fire of the solar bark passing through the underworld hours, the protective figures standing at the doors between one register of the netherworld and the next. A 2011 study from the University of Southern California, analyzing pigment samples from 3 Valley of the Kings tombs, KV62 Tutankhamun's burial shrine, KV55, and KV14, the tomb of Tausret, confirmed cinnabar use in all 3 burial spaces, not as trace contamination, as a primary pigment component applied intentionally in specific iconographic contexts. That's where the surface account ends. The enclosed chamber has a different account. Mercury vapor is invisible, odorless. It produces no immediate symptoms at the ambient concentrations released by ground cinnabar at workshop temperatures. What it does instead is accumulate. Mercury crosses the blood-brain barrier and binds to sulfur-containing proteins in neural tissue. Its biological half-life in the central nervous system is approximately 70 to 90 days. The clinical picture of chronic low-level exposure, what occupational medicine designates as micromercurialism, develops slowly. First, a fine hand tremor the affected person might attribute to fatigue, then changes in memory and verbal recall, then personality shifts that people close to the affected person notice before the person themselves does. Eventually, gross neurological deterioration. The symptoms are nonspecific enough that no person experiencing them in an environment without the conceptual framework of toxicology would be able to correctly identify their cause. The servants in the place of truth ground cinnabar inside sealed stone chambers with oil lamp ventilation. Grinding cinnabar releases mercury vapor at ambient temperature. The concentration of mercury vapor achievable inside a closed tomb corridor during an active grinding and application session exceeds modern occupational exposure limits that did not exist as a regulatory category until the 20th century. The workers had no threshold to compare against, no symptom they could assign to the red powder they mixed each morning. A 2019 publication in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, based on skeletal analysis of Deir el-Medina burial populations, established an average lifespan for the guild workers of approximately 40 to 43 years. The researchers attributed this to physical stress from the labor, dietary limitations, and occupational injury from working in confined spaces with hand tools. Mercury toxicity was not among the variables assessed. No systematic study of the Deir el-Medina skeletal population has included heavy metal analysis of bone tissue. Once the tombs were sealed, the cinnabar walls continued to outgas. Mercury vapor does not dissipate in a sealed enclosed space. It accumulates. The mummies of the pharaohs, laid in burial chambers whose every wall was painted with the images meant to carry them into eternity, were preserved inside an environment that grew measurably more mercury saturated with each passing century. The paintings were meant to carry Egypt's kings into eternity. What the sealed darkness was doing inside those chambers is a different calculation entirely. Number 1. Cocaine. In 1992, Dr. Svetlana Balabanova, a forensic toxicologist at the Institute of Forensic Medicine at the University of Ulm, published the results of a systematic chemical analysis in the journal Naturwissenschaften. The study examined hair, skin, and bone samples from 9 Egyptian mummies held in the Egyptian collection of the Bavarian State Museum in Munich. The specimens dated from approximately 1000 BCE to 400 C, 14 centuries of Egyptian history, 9 individuals drawn from different burial sites, different time periods, and different apparent social contexts. The analytical methodology was radioimmunoassay confirmed by gas chromatography mass spectrometry, the same dual verification protocol used in criminal forensic toxicology, specifically chosen because it eliminates the false positive rate that single method testing cannot exclude. Both methods had to agree for a result to stand. All 9 mummies tested positive for nicotine, 8 tested positive for cocaine alkaloids, 6 tested positive for cannabis. The academic response was immediate, and it was not scientific. The findings were attributed to contamination. Museum visitors smoking tobacco over 2 centuries had left nicotine residue on the specimens. 19th century collectors who handled the mummies while using tobacco products had contaminated the surface tissue. The conservation chemicals used during the 19th and early 20th century storage and display of the mummies had produced false positives that mimicked cocaine alkaloid signatures in the assay. The dismissal was confident. It was rapid. It did not engage with the chemistry on the chemistry's own terms. But here's where the contamination hypothesis breaks down against the data. Balaba Nova's samples were not taken from external surfaces. The hair samples were extracted from the interior of the hair shaft, the cortex, a structure that does not accumulate ambient surface contaminants at the concentrations found. The bone tissue samples came from the interior of the cortical bone matrix, which is not accessible to surface contaminants under normal museum storage conditions. Nicotine from ambient tobacco smoke does not penetrate the hair cortex at the concentrations Balaba Nova measured. Cocaine alkaloids do not bind to bone mineral through external exposure. The control experiments run on modern mummies with confirmed non-exposure histories produced clean results across all alkaloid categories. Subsequent independent analyses using different mummy specimens from separate museum collections confirmed alkaloid markers consistent with coca plant alkaloids in multiple specimens. The finding has not been uniformly replicated by every laboratory that has looked. It has not been chemically disproven by any. The problem the results create is not analytical. It is geographic. Cocaine is produced from Erythroxylum coca. The plant grows in the high Andes of South America between roughly 500 and 2,000 meters elevation, in conditions of specific humidity and soil chemistry that do not exist outside its native range. No species of Erythroxylum native to Africa, Europe, Asia, or the Middle East produces cocaine alkaloids. No plant in any of those regions produces cocaine alkaloids at any meaningful concentration. No candidate species has been identified in the paleobotanical record of the Old World that could account for the alkaloid profile Balaba Nova found. Nicotine's dominant natural source is Nicotiana tabacum. The genus Nicotiana is native to the Americas. The species that became the commercial tobacco plant was domesticated in the region of modern Bolivia and northern Argentina. In 1000 BC, the approximate date of Balaba Nova's oldest confirmed positive specimen, no population in Egypt, Africa, or Eurasia had contact with Nicotiana tabacum or any of its alkaloid-containing relatives. The oldest mummy in Balaba Nova's study died approximately 2,400 years before Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean. In the 3 decades since the Naturwissenschaften paper, the mainstream academic response has been to dispute the data rather than to explain it. The structure of the argument, stated explicitly, is circular. The Egyptians could not have had access to American plants. Therefore, the analytical result must be wrong. Therefore, no explanation of the result is. This is a historical assumption being used to adjudicate a chemical finding. It is not a scientific refutation. It is a priority decision, the established timeline of the historical consensus placed above the mass spectrometer reading, and not required to compete with it on evidentiary terms. Several alternative explanations have been proposed and have not survived. The now extinct Mediterranean coca analog, no such plant has been identified in the botanical or paleobotanical record anywhere in the Old World. The laboratory error, Balaba Nova's protocols have been reviewed and found methodologically sound. The confirmation by independent laboratories using different specimens and different methods makes a single laboratory error insufficient as an explanation. The museum contamination vector, the concentrations found in cortical bone and hair shaft interior, are not achievable through surface contamination under any demonstrated mechanism. 9 mummies, 14 centuries, multiple burial sites, different social levels and burial contexts. The compound profile is consistent across individuals who shared nothing except the geography of the Nile Valley and the chemistry found in their preserved tissue. The academic consensus currently prefers the absence of an explanation to the presence of a disturbing one. That preference is itself a kind of burial. Something was sealed into those bodies that the historical framework we were taught has no account for. The mummies have been opened. The chemistry has been run. The result sits in a journal paper published in 1992 in a state of official non-existence, formally acknowledged in the literature, formally contested, never formally retracted, and never formally explained. Either the contact history between the old and new worlds is more ancient and more sophisticated than any current mainstream model allows, or we have 9 mummies from one of the most thoroughly documented civilizations in human history containing a chemical compound that, according to everything we were taught about who had access to what and when, could not be there. Both possibilities are worse than the question. The jar was opened more than 30 years ago. The answer still has not come out. 10 substances. 10 separate lines of chemical evidence converging on the same structural question. What did ancient Egypt understand about what it was sealing inside those tombs? And why did that understanding require compounds that altered consciousness, dissolved the boundary between the waking self and what lay beyond it, and in at least one case, came from a part of the world that the historical record insists ancient Egyptians had no knowledge of? The standard scholarly answer is theological. These compounds were placed in the tombs because Egyptian religion assigned them there, as symbols, as provisions for a mythological journey, as material expressions of a belief system we now read from. The theology is real, the documents are real, the interpretive framework has intellectual integrity, the chemistry runs alongside it without deferring to it. Every compound on this list has a documented pharmacological mechanism that operates regardless of the theological framework in which it was embedded. Every one was handled by people who showed, through preparation protocols and dosing records and restricted access structures and centuries of consistent ritual use, that they understood its effects on human consciousness and human tissue. They wrote this down. The Ebers Papyrus, the London Medical Papyrus, the Edfu wall inscriptions, the Amarna letters. These are not allegorical documents. They are technical records produced by a civilization that made no clean separation between medicine and religion, between chemistry and theology, between the preparation of the living and the preparation of the dead. What remains unresolved is not the chemistry. The chemistry can be recovered from residue in sealed vessels, from the tissue of preserved bodies, from the pigment on tomb walls, from the hair shafts of the dead. The results come back with names and molecular weights and binding affinities and half-lives. What remains unresolved is the intent behind the sealing. Why did Egypt bury its most important dead with compounds that altered consciousness, with substances that sedated and dissociated and dissolved the ordinary boundary between a person and the world around them? What were they sending with the dead that the living had used to reach somewhere the living could not otherwise go? The tombs were not passive storage containers. They were engineered environments, architecturally designed, chemically stocked, ritually sealed for a transit whose destination was described in the same administrative language that recorded the preparation protocols. The chemistry confirms the preparation. The destination remains the only variable the compounds cannot illuminate. Whatever Egypt believed was waiting, whatever the blue lotus was meant to open, whatever the Kai-Fi was burning toward, whatever compound was sealed alongside the body of a person whose tissue still carries the alkaloid fingerprint of a plant that, by every account we have, should not have been there, that knowledge left the world with the last priest who held it intact. The sealed chambers are open. The compounds are named. The jars are empty. The question they were answering is not. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.